Now, you might think it's time to stop talking about politicians breaking COVID rules, but the reason it's still an important story is because of the ordinary Brits who are still going through the courts to deal with their own inconsequential fines. Michael Simmons, the Spectator's data journalist, looked at this in this week's magazine. Michael joins me now. So, Michael, we've just been talking about Beergate and Partygate, and a lot of people, I think, are getting quite bored with these stories, thinking they're quite trivial. But you make the point in your sidebar to Katie Balls's cover piece this week that actually a lot of people are still getting fined for transgressions that were even less than having a beer or having a birthday cake. Can you tell us about these cases that are still going through the courts right now from COVID?
Yeah, so absolutely. Basically, because a lot of the courts were obviously shut during the lockdowns and the general court backlog built up, it's exactly the same with people that were fined during the lockdowns and during the tiered restrictions. A lot of those cases are kind of only just getting through the court system now. So in the weeks where kind of Partygate's been going on, we've still seen that these 136,000 fines across Britain are being dealt with. And there's some kind of really interesting examples of, fines for ridiculous things, fines where you think the people are banging to rights, and fines that are really similar to what's happened in Partygate and Beergate. Some of the examples on the kind of bigger end, there was a student in Leeds was fined £10,000 because, as he says, for a joke, he made this Facebook event to say, oh, let's have a big snowball fight. And then within a couple of hours, he thought, oh, this joke's a bad idea, it's got out of hand. So he deleted the event, but hundreds of people turned up to this park where the snowball fight was to be anyway, and he ended up with a £10,000 fine. On the 18th of December, which is the day of one of the Downing Street alleged Christmas parties, a pub in Devon also had its own Christmas party, and the landlord of the pub ended up with £4,000 worth of fines. And he's kind of really miffed about this because, as far as we know, nobody in Downing Street has been fined more than £50 so far. So there's kind of the question about, there seems to be a certain discrepancy between fines. The other interesting thing with the fines is if you do choose to contest your fine, which, by the way, most people don't. From the data we've seen, only about 2% of fines actually get contested, and then you end up going through the court processes. The judges are kind of not really interested in much mitigation or what your actual COVID risk was. So as an example, the regulation about not being in gatherings of more than two people, a judge has said, in court documents that there's essentially no defence to this. If you're with more than two people, then that's you've broken the law. A couple of kind of harrowing examples of this. One was an elderly man he said he felt quite lonely, and he went to visit his allotment, and there he was found chatting to people at the allotment, and he ended up with a fine. Similarly, there was a lady who had been helping with childcare with somebody who was in a support bubble, which was allowed, and it was the child's birthday, so she went round to the mother's house to drop off a birthday card. She didn't go in the house, she says, but when she got there, she didn't realise that the person she went to see had guests round illegally, and because she was essentially caught on the doorstep, she ended up with a fine. And again, the magistrate judges are kind of not interested, or they don't seem to be as interested in these defences, and the people all end up being fined.
It's incredible because the examples you have, people's fines obviously range from the customary £100, which is £50 if you pay it in half the amount of time, to £10,000, as you say. We talk about this, cost of living crisis. And, I can understand if you organise a massive event, as the student was accused of doing, you have to pay more. But, for people like this pensioner, just being present while other people are there, outdoors, which we now know is not so bad for the virus. And the fact that he's getting fined £100, it does seem pretty shocking. You'd mentioned this discrepancy between the Devon landlord and Downing Street party happening on the same day. Is that because it's like a racking up of fines as you go with multiple transgressions, as it were?
Yeah, so the case of the Devon landlord seemed to be that essentially he was fined twice on the one day, because of kind of the severity of him being the owner of the pub and the alleged event organiser. And then I think he then committed another offence that was similar, so the fines racked up. And again, you might say, well, is this not similar to kind of some of the alleged events we've heard about from Downing Street? But what's really interesting when you look at some of the reporting around the court cases is that not only can there be discrepancy between cases, there's even cases where there's discrepancy in the same incident. So one example was from a chippy or chip shop in Notting Hill, where the owner had decided that he needed to have a crisis meeting, or what he called a crisis meeting, to discuss some staffing issue. So all the staff went round his house and they were spotted and reported, and the police came. And the police felt that this was a meeting that, although business meetings were allowed at that time, there was no reason why this meeting wasn't held online. So the police issued everyone with fixed penalty notices, and some of the cases ended up going to court. And two of the staff, one pleaded guilty, and they ended up with a fine, I think it was around £600. But another member of staff, on the exact same evidence, didn't enter a plea and ended up being acquitted. So actually, within the same incidents, we're seeing discrepancies as well.
And also across the country, isn't there? Because throughout all our discussion of this, we're talking about the Metropolitan Police in London versus the Durham Police, and they have different standards, which is something that you write about in your piece as well, that Durham Police has been a bit more lenient. I mean, the problem at the end of the day is that these COVID rules were probably just not clear enough, not well drafted enough in order to ensure consistency when applied across the country. And so you end up with weird exceptions.
Yes, exactly. So if we look at the data that's available from the police, you do see kind of variations between forces, and a lot of that will have been because of the different lockdown tiers and because of populations. But for example, Durham Police, which you mentioned, I think I say in the piece, have so far issued about 1,000 fines, whereas North Yorkshire, which is a neighbouring force, I think has issued over 4,000. So there's that discrepancy there. I think the other issue is, especially after the first lockdown, and we got to know a bit more about COVID, about how it didn't tend to you couldn't really catch it outdoors. I think people started to apply their own common sense, and you can argue whether they should or shouldn't have done that. And I think people decided, right, if I'm going to meet someone, I'll do it outside because at least it's safe. And the problem is the law essentially didn't allow you to make that your own judgment. And it looks like anecdotally is some police forces have sort of said, okay, we'll become more lenient because of common sense, where other police forces have said, no, we'll apply everything kind of to the letter of the law. But what's interesting as well is the attitude seems to have changed kind of within magistrates' courts as well. Because if you look at some of the earlier cases, I saw one count was that only around 1% of people who claimed they weren't guilty were sort of winning their cases. But now that's gone up to about 15%. So it's kind of unlikely that, suddenly people were 15% less guilty later on. It's more that the kind of magistrates' attitudes have changed. And that it's been pointed out by various legal watchdogs that suggests that actually many maybe of these past fines and convictions are sort of unjust and perhaps even unlawful.
And it's incredible, we talk about this backlog in the courts that, transgressions like going to your allotment and talking to your neighbours are still going through the courts, as you say, over 100,000 of them. And just finally, Michael, what if you decide not to pay your fine? What happens if you just put your foot down and say, I'm going to appeal, but my appeal has been a failure, but I'm just not going to pay the fine?
Yeah, so if you don't pay within your 28 days, you will probably end up with a case before the magistrates' courts. And the majority of these cases are dealt with for this legal mechanism called the single justice procedure. And that's a procedure it's designed really to keep people sort of out of actual courtrooms. And it's designed more for things like non-payment of the licence fee. And people have been quite critical of this single justice procedure because it means that your case isn't heard in open court. Essentially, it's done what, as they call, on the papers. You sort of write in your plea and your evidence, and then a magistrate and a legal advisor will kind of sit and adjudicate. And that's not really done in a courtroom. In earlier stages of the pandemic, literally the magistrate could be working from home, and it was really hard to find out through public court listings where these were going on. In Westminster Magistrates, as an example, they ended up designating this on their court lists as Courtroom 78, which isn't a physical courtroom that actually exists. So insiders kind of say this has now become the name for these cases, it's a Courtroom 78 case.
And you say that you can just, if you miss the letter, you could just not know that you've been served one of these. And one man found out that he was being fined through his local paper.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the Mail had reported this, that there was a man in Reading who, I think it was a fairly minor misdemeanour that he kind of committed. And with these single justice procedures, there's no sort of requirement for you to be served with papers or for like receipt of papers. So if you get this fine, you don't pay it because like you say that you've not received any court documents, and the court will still hear your case, assume you're not engaging, and then you can be issued with your fine. And local newspapers will go through these kind of charge lists and report, such and such Joe Blogs has received this fine, and this unfortunate man, discovered that he'd been fined literally through reading his local paper.
Incredible. Michael Simmons, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.